This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. Name of the podcast though, well, I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, behind the scenes stories, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. As part and parcel of the podcast, I try not to do snark, I try not to punch down. I just think it's an achievement and a half to get a film made, and if anything, this podcast is a celebration of that. I'm also delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by the lovely folks at cinemaparadiso.co.uk. They are the largest Blu-ray, 4K and DVD rental service here in the UK. They send out physical discs via Royal Mail. Subscription packages for cinemaparadiso.co.uk start at £5.99. Over 100,000 titles in stock, loads of films you won't find on streaming services as well as brand new releases too, and it's physical media. Love physical media. Talking of a film I've just watched on physical media, how's that for a link? I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going back to 2010, had an awful lot of fun going back through this one. Play you a clip, pick up the story the other side of this.
I need to do something substantial in order to get the attention of the clubs.
Why?
Because they're exclusive and fun, and they lead to a better life.
People want to go on the internet and check out their friends, so why not build a website that offers that? Friends, pictures, profiles.
I'm talking about taking the entire social experience of college and putting it online.
The site got 2,200 hits within 2 hours.
22,000.
This idea is potentially worth millions of dollars.
Millions? You stole our website.
They're saying we stole the Facebook.
I know what it says.
So did we?
$1 million isn't cool. You know what's cool? $1 billion.
You're going to get left behind. It's moving faster than any of us ever imagined it would.
Let's sue him in federal court.
I can't wait to stand over your shoulder and watch you write us a check.
If you guys were the inventors of Facebook, you'd have invented Facebook.
Is there anything that you need to tell me?
Your actions could have permanently destroyed everything I've been working on.
We have been working on.
Did you like being a joke? Do you want to go back to that?
Mark! This is our time.
You're being accused of intentionally breaching security, violating copyrights, violating individual.
That then was a clip from 2010's The Social Network, directed by David Fincher. Screenplay for this one by Aaron Sorkin, based on Ben Mesrich's book, The Accidental Billionaires, with a cast including Jesse Eisenberg, Rooney Mara, Andrew Garfield, Justin Timberlake, Armie Hammer and Max Minghella. Now, in theory, the start of this particular film project was the book The Accidental Billionaires, about primarily Mark Zuckerberg, the rise of Facebook, and the fact that all these young people from Harvard suddenly made a social networking site that basically dominated the world. But even before the book was finished, its publishers saw the film potential in this one and started shopping it around Hollywood studios. There was certainly interest. I mean, who hadn't heard of Facebook? But also, Facebook was very big. Facebook has very big, expensive lawyers, and that is in no way reflected in the way I'm going to discuss this film. I'm not scared, cough. Now, as Aaron Sorkin would tell the Writers Guild of America's The Craft series, he was one of those who got the 14-page book proposal that Ben Mesrich had written for his publisher for the book. Now, the publisher was shopping it around for a film sale, and as Sorkin said, that's how it wound up in my hands. I was reading it, and somewhere on page 3 I said yes. It was the fastest I said yes to anything. Now, also saying yes to it was Sony Pictures. Sony was in the market for stuff like that. The turn of going into the end of the noughties and the early 2010s, Sony was still one of the studios who was looking actively for kind of original standalone films, and this was one of those that really fitted what it was after. Now, Sorkin himself was drawn by the fact that Mesrich's story wasn't really the story of Facebook. The reason he said yes on page 3 was that it had nothing in his eyes to do with Facebook. He said the invention itself is as modern as it gets, but the story is as old as storytelling. The themes of friendship, loyalty, jealousy, class and power. Sony duly acquired the film and Sorkin was quickly on board to write it. But also, in theory, he was going to adapt the book. The problem was the book wasn't finished, that Ben Mesrich hadn't finished writing it. And so the assumption was Sorkin would hang around, wait for the book manuscript to be delivered, and then he would start adapting it. That wasn't really an assumption that Sorkin was keen to play to. He was really interested in this right here, right now. So he opted not to read it, really. Well, I say opted, he didn't really have an awful lot of choice because he wanted to get going. And so what happened is Mesrich and Sorkin were doing research on the same topic at the same time, but writing their stories independently of each other, and every now and then they would meet up and just compare notes just to make sure they're roughly on the same metaphorical page. Part of the research was Harvard alumnus Natalie Portman, who threw a dinner party. She's told this story for Aaron Sorkin with some of her friends. Now, Portman had been to Harvard, and so she gave Aaron Sorkin a load of insider info, and he rewarded her with a line that appears in the final cut of the film. The biggest thing on a campus that included 19 Nobel laureates, 15 Pulitzer Prize winners, 2 future Olympians, and a movie star. That movie star was Natalie Portman. She was actually named in one of the deleted scenes from the film, but as we'll come to, David Fincher shoots a fair amount of coverage. So by the time the book was actually finished and in Sorkin's hand, the screenplay for this one was about 80% done already. Now, he talked about the research he went and did. He said he went and did a lot of first-person research with a number of the people that were involved in the story. Quite a few of whom did that cooperated with Sorkin on the strict condition of anonymity. But Sorkin said, what I found, and this is to the Writers Guild of America, was that 2 lawsuits were brought against Facebook at roughly the same time, that the defendant plaintiffs' witnesses all came into a deposition room and swore under oath, and 3 different versions of the story were told. And so he said, instead of choosing one and deciding that's the truest one, or choosing one and deciding that's the juiciest one, I decided to dramatise the idea that there were 3 different versions of the story being told, and that's how the structure of the film came together. That I don't think it's going massively spoilery to say a good chunk of it jumps backwards and forwards in time, and a chunk of it takes place in a deposition room with the core characters all around the table. It took Sorkin a year to deliver the screenplay, roughly, and when it came in, it was at 161 pages. Now, the old cliche with movies is 1 page of screenplay equals 1 minute of screen time, and Sony was looking to, he was going to spend about 40 million in the end on the film. It needed a commercially viable film, and 2 hours 40 minutes of tech nerds making Facebook was not that in its eyes. It wanted Sorkin to cut the script down before it would ultimately commit to the movie. In the meantime, though, the script was certainly getting attention. It ended up on the Blacklist. If you're not familiar with this is the list that's published every year of the best unproduced screenplays in Hollywood. The Social Network was very much on that list. But then in came David Fincher. Now, his involvement was announced in the middle of 2009. He came in off the back of his Oscar-nominated hit, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, that he'd had an exhaustive journey just trying to get that one made. But when Fincher came in, he argued, well, the script actually isn't that long. Sony disagreed, but Sorkin and Fincher quickly hit it off. And as Sorkin said, the first time I worked with David, and he's corroborated this in his own interviews, he came to my house with a stopwatch and said, I want you to read out loud every scene at the pace you heard it when you were writing it. It took just under 2 hours to read the script. Now, Sony still wasn't sure, but Fincher was. This 161-page script was going to result in a 2-hour movie. Let's have a bit spoiler and jump to the end. It resulted in a 2-hour movie. So Fincher on board. I mean, Benjamin Button certainly helped grease the wheels there, but also who didn't want to work with David Fincher at this point? Casting was duly underway. Now, the cast for this one was going to have to be young. That to this point, Fincher primarily had worked with experienced actors who got some degree of well, they'd worked in the film business. They knew their way about the film set, because going to the cliche, but also it's true, Fincher's film sets are relatively intense. You are expected to do a lot of takes. That's the same for the second film I'm going to talk about in this podcast as well. Lots and lots and lots of takes. He needed people who could come in and deliver. And so he needed actors who had the degree of experience in spite of their young age. He would tell journalist Mark Harris in an interview. I will say another thing that I think is really interesting, which is that I went into this saying, whatever happens, I'm not casting any of those Disney kids. And they're all Disney kids, and they're all great. Thank God for the Disney kids, because they're awesome. Thank God for the Justin Timberlake and Brenda Songs of the world, and Joe Mazzello, who grew up on movie sets, and Jesse and Andrew. Andrew acted in his first movie when he was 9 or something. I sort of said to myself, I'm not going to go for movie brats or television brats, but now I have to say that they were so prepared, they knew how to work, and that was it. So, let's dig into some of that casting. I mean, Andrew Garfield, he was originally in the running for the role of Mark Zuckerberg, and Fincher saw him for that, but he didn't quite buy him for it, and instead recommended that he try for the also crucial and slightly more empathetic role of Eduardo Severin, and Garfield was duly cast. In terms of the role of Sean Parker, ultimately taken by Justin Timberlake in the film, I mean, Jonah Hill was in the running and he met Fincher. Jonah Hill had just had a hit with Superbad for Sony as well. Fincher didn't quite buy it and just went for Timberlake. The role of Mark Zuckerberg actually was offered to Shia LaBeouf first and foremost, but he would turn it down. When it came to Jesse Eisenberg, well, I mean, it all looked like an obvious choice on paper, but again, going back to that Mark Harris interview, Fincher says of the person to play Zuckerberg, we looked and looked and looked, we read every young actor in Hollywood. It had been rumoured on blogs and stuff that we were talking to Jesse Eisenberg, and I hate to be told what to do by blogs, so I was like, yeah, we should probably see him, but I don't know if this is his thing. And Eisenberg, he'll corroborate this in his own interview, he put himself on tape reading the first scene, sent a little QuickTime video to Fincher, who saw it, and he saw that Eisenberg, in his words, here's this kid doing Sorkin, the first person that we'd heard who could do Sorkin better than Sorkin. Eisenberg had actually originally been asked to audition, as several of the actors were, with some of Aaron Sorkin's material from the West Wing TV show, but he was reluctant to do so, and the tape that he ultimately sent to Fincher was made with his sister, with the script for The Social Network, and he sent it off, didn't think it was particularly good, but he got the call to fly to California a couple of days later, and The Social Network had found its Mark Zuckerberg. In fact, as part of his preparation, Eisenberg would set up a Facebook account under a false name. As soon as the production was was finished, that account was duly shut down. No point trying to add him there, chums. Others did have to audition with that West Wing script. The film at that point, to the auditionees, was known as Aaron Sorkin Project, but it was finally at a point with the young cast in place that it was pretty much ready to go in the autumn of 2009. It's worth noting that Fincher brought in the film's composers early, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, whose score to the film is just wonderful. But what that meant is, because they were able to start on the music early, when it actually came to post-production, the editors could cut the film together using existing score. So October 2009 then, start of production. Well, sort of the start of production. Sorkin and Fincher, I mean, it's worth noting there's extensive documentary stuff on the discs of this one, and Sorkin and Fincher are side by side on it. I found that really quite interesting, that film is often seen as a director's medium and the writer's nowhere to be seen on set. In this case, this is the exception to the rule. There is Sorkin at Fincher's side for large chunks of this. But just because October 2009 was the start of production, that isn't actually when filming began. Because first and foremost, what Fincher did was he insisted on a rehearsal period for it. But even before he could start that, the film had spiked on blogs and news websites because its screenplay had leaked. Now, Fincher did not take this news particularly well. To say he wasn't on the happy side, and but one of the ramifications of the script leak was it just made the film slightly more accurate. In that there was a bit in the screenplay where the phone call to Cameron Winklevoss's father, one of the characters in the film, was being shot, and again, as Fincher told Mark Harris, I told him I wanted to say at the end of the call, "I love you, Dad." It's not in the script, but that's the kind of kid this guy is. It should be surprising that this 6'5", 220-pound kid says that, and I don't know the Winklevi, but they somehow gotten hold of the script because it was on the clucking internet. So Fincher said of that, "I just resent the whole. I resent the whole. I hate the idea of pre-auditioning clay pigeons for people. I really resent the idea of people reading screenplays that have yet to be produced." But then the Winklevi got in touch and said that's not actually my dad's name. That Aaron Sorkin had changed the name in the script, and so little details like that mattered, right down on set to what drink Mark Zuckerberg was drinking in the bit where he codes Facebook. All those little things, Fincher argued, if we got a chance to get the details right, we may as well get those details right. Now, a lot of this was worked out in 3 weeks of rehearsal. That was pretty much sitting around a table talking about the scenes in a pretty nondescript boardroom, really. And quite a lot of this material's on the internet if you want to find it. So, for instance, there's you see bits in there like a dispute between the actors, and it's Eisenberg and Garfield with Fincher and Sorkin primarily in the room. There's a dispute about the line "I'm CEO, bitch." Can they land that line, they question. Eisenberg joked that he spoke around 3 times during that 3 weeks of period because he was just trying to absorb it all, really. But because David Fincher and Aaron Sorkin were in the room, with Justin Timberlake as well, I should know, they were just working through the script bit by bit, streamlining the lines, talking about how they should be played. And Fincher just wanted them there. He wanted his core cast in there. Not in the room, meanwhile, were Armie Hammer, who has been in headlines recently. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that, and Josh Pence, who had been cast as the Winklevoss brothers. Now, just going back to casting slightly, Fincher and his team had been looking for identical twins to play them, but couldn't find them. Pence was cast in the movie, but then he got the word from his agent that he was going to be in the movie, but he sort of wasn't going to be in the movie. And so, what was going to happen was he was going to shoot the scenes opposite Armie Hammer as the two brothers. His physicality would be in there, but his physical resemblance would not. He would have to wear dots on his face, and Armie Hammer's face would be mapped to his in post-production. Now, Pence at first wasn't best chuffed about this, but decided, well, when am I going to get a chance to make a David Fincher film like this? So he watched the film, David Cronenberg's film, Dead Ringers, and saw how Jeremy Irons would find the difference sometimes, just in little ways, where the character, because he plays identical twins in that film, and he saw how there were different ways that Irons just put the weight on his feet, for instance, and just changed the gait slightly. And so he adopted that. Hammer and Pence would have to do an awful lot of preparation as well, learning to row for their sequences in the film. And in the end, Josh Pence does get a very, very brief cameo in the movie as well, where we do actually get to see his face. When it came to the actual shooting of the movie, well, the location they needed was Harvard University. That's where the events in the Social Network primarily took place, but Harvard University was not having it. That Variety reported that the words of Director of Photography Jeff Cronenworth, that he said they weren't particularly helpful. A film about student infighting and lawsuits that followed was not a great subject for them, and so they denied permission for the film to shoot there. Now, there's a story that goes around that after the 1970 movie Love Story shot at Harvard, it resulted in a lot of damage to the campus, and as a result, Harvard had no wish at all to bring film crews back. Fincher wasn't happy with this. I mean, authenticity is key to him, but he had to realise that he couldn't shoot there, and it was Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore that would do most of the doubling for Harvard. However, guerrilla tactics did just get a slight blink and you miss it look at the university campus. That early on in the film, there's a sequence where Jesse Eisenberg's Mark Zuckerberg runs across Harvard Square and at night, and to get the shot right, what they did, I mean, the filmmakers had a challenge because they knew they were getting a shot they didn't have permission to get. They needed to throw some backlighting on the arches nearby, which were on the campus. So the bridge itself wasn't, but the arches were. And so, as Cronenworth said, David came up with the idea of a battery cart with some lights on it. Then he got a street performer to take the cart onto the campus, light the arches while he mimed until Jesse ran by. Then he'd turn off the lights and leave. And they used a mime artist because they figured if security tried to stop him, we wouldn't be able to talk. So by the time that they got the mime artist out of there, the shot would be in the can. Now, multiple cameras were used. I mean, Fincher chose to shoot this one digitally, and he did. I mean, the first scene of the movie takes place in a incredible scene. That was 10 pages that was done in about, 5-6 minutes of screen time, where we see Mark Zuckerberg, Jesse Eisenberg's Mark Zuckerberg, sat opposite Rooney Mara's Erica Albright as the pair break up. Now, that was a scene, really, that just put a marker down. So for Jesse Eisenberg, for instance, he'd mainly done low-budget films to this point where even securing permits to shoot was tricky. Here, he was afforded the opportunity to sit in the same location, surrounded by extras when needed, for 2 days to get this scene right. And they went through these 10 pages. That the first half day of it was just blocking it and setting it all up. And then they ran through the scene, Eisenberg and Mara, 99 times over the course of 2 days. And Eisenberg said it helped him more than anything get into the character that he was set to play. That Fincher would just duck in and just make little suggestions and get both Mara and Eisenberg just to dig into ideas that they had and really just set the scene for the movie and also set the scene for the shoot. There was some sequence that there was one sequence that Eisenberg was dreading, which is when the film goes to Los Angeles. Again, I don't think that's a massive spoiler, and it involves a swimming pool, and Eisenberg just didn't want to do that particularly. As it turned out, Fincher would change the blocking of that scene, and so Eisenberg, let's just politely say, stayed dry. Fincher then, he doesn't massively like to talk about the fact that he does multiple takes, but he's always been a kind of, I'd prefer having lots and lots of takes over special effects or a tank or something like that. And he's always argued too that if you're going to have all the effort of getting all those people on a set, all that equipment there, going to get it all up the mountain, you may as well do something with it. So this meant lots and lots and lots of goes of various scenes, but it also brought with it some side challenges, such as Armie Hammer having to eat a burger over and over and over again. A guy who had to throw up over and over and over again. If you go back to like a bar scene and you see people having their drinks, imagine that after every time Fincher called cut, although he didn't call cut an awful lot, he just said go again, and they just kept rolling and rolling, which you could do with digital, of course. But imagine every drink had to be replenished to the exact level just for the sake of continuity. There was also, in the midst of it all, the deposition sequence that I just mentioned right near the start. And that's one of the rare occasions in a movie where all of the core actors, all of the core creatives can get around a table for a scene together. And this was really, Eisenberg's talked about this, about just that kind of scene just doesn't come along very often at all. The movie then was heading towards the end of its physical production. But let's go back to Aaron Sorkin for the last shot of the film, because I glossed over this earlier. Sorkin had actually been due to make his directorial debut with The Social Network. He wouldn't make his directorial debut until Molly's Game in 2017 in the end. But after Fincher had read the script and had decided he wanted to come aboard just a few days later, it was conditional on the fact that Sorkin was happy to step aside. And Sorkin was happy to step aside. It proved a wise career. I don't think they were looking at it as career moves, but it proved a wise move for the film and for the pair of them. But there was the last shot in the film. Fincher told Sorkin that he was due to direct it, that he was going to get get in his car, go home, and Sorkin could direct the rest of the film. And Fincher was as good as his word. He got in his car and left. And so there's a shot of just under a second in the film that Sorkin directed. And originally he just did 2 takes of it. But it was Bob Wagner, the first assistant director on the film, said David will kill me if I only give him 2 shots to choose from. So they went back and did it a few more times just before the main bulk of filming wrapped up. Now, it's worth noting as well that Facebook did not give cooperation for The Social Network. In fact, talking to Time Out, David Fincher said they had a list of a dozen requirements for their participation, and the first 2 were, it can't take place at Harvard, and you can't call it Facebook. And so they relayed these terms to producer Scott Rudin, who'd been going backwards and forwards just to try and get permissions. And as Fincher said, Rudin, who's not a dumb guy, just said that the discussions didn't need to go any further. We're going to make a movie about the litigation, as the depositions are all part of the public record, and we can glean from them the drama that we need to make our film. The final shots of The Social Network didn't actually get in the can until about 2-3 months before the film was ultimately released, and that was because they had to wait to get the Royal Regatta rowing scenes that we ultimately get in the movie, because you could only film that at the point it was taking place in the middle of summer. In all, the film would shoot as well as at Johns Hopkins University. It would go to Los Angeles for certain scenes. It would come to the UK and shoot in Henley-on-Thames. It would be in Massachusetts as well. But filming duly wrapped up, and it was heading towards its much anticipated release. Now, in post-production, some work was required just to trim the film to get it to a PG-13 rating, which Sony had mandated for its release in the US. That for instance, there's a moment where the character of Mark Zuckerberg is passed a note in the middle of a lecture hall which has an unpleasant message on it. Let's just say the original message that was on that note would win enough to get the film an R rating in the US alone. There's a moment, going spoiler light, which involves the use of cocaine. That had to be trimmed really, really, really carefully in order for that to get that PG-13 rating from the Motion Picture Association of America. That's one of their triggers that tends to knock things up to an R. I should point out that a very early cut of the film was actually screened for representatives for Facebook as well, that they were allowed to see what was coming. And Fincher's phrase describing this, and again he said it's Time Out, was they were, quote, appropriately appalled by what they saw. Running alongside the post-production process on the movie, there was the marketing campaign for it, and a really smart marketing campaign as well, that the poster really, really struck a chord. And the original tagline of you can't make 300 million friends without making a few enemies, well, that was changed relatively late in the day, because the consideration was, well, by the time the film's actually out, the number of members that Facebook would have would likely be up to 500 million, and so they changed it and crossed their fingers that it would be the case, and it was the case. Fincher would say, just going back to that Time Out interview, his problem with the ad campaign was you can't say punk genius billionaire, which is one of the taglines, because it's using that narcissistic MTV flash to get kids interested. I wanted to include Judas or traitor because you've got to have a bad word in there. Punk genius billionaire is basically a giant, well, let's just say, degree of oral pleasure going on. In post-production, there was quite a lot of digital effects work that needed to be done, not least the aforementioned supplanting of Armie Hammer's head on Josh Pence's body, but also as the edit came together, they could get relatively close to the final movie because they did, as I mentioned before, have the music in place. If you read through the end credits, by the way, you should see that there's a special thanks for Steven Soderbergh in there, filmmaker Steven Soderbergh. The reason he gets a special thanks in there is he lent the production 2 of the digital cameras that it used in the shooting of the movie. The film then debuted on September the 24th, 2010 at the New York Film Festival, and the initial raft of reviews for it was, to be fair, was strong, and I would suggest that over time the reputation of the movie has just grown still further. I think Quentin Tarantino recently, at the time this was recorded, called it the best film of the 2010s, and it would go on to get an awful lot of awards attentions as well, that the Golden Globes were interested, the BAFTAs were interested, got nominated for 8 Oscars as well, but and it won 3. It won it for Sorkin's script, for the score, for the film editing, but the best director gong and the best picture gong, well, that went to The King's Speech and to Cats director Tom Hooper. Box office wise, it got its wide release in the US the weekend of October the 1st to the 3rd, went straight to the top of the box office charts. Well, opened in first place. The 40 million movie grossed 22.4 million in the US in its opening week. The other films around at that time, well, two other films opened that weekend, Let Me In and Case 39. It knocked Wall Street Money Never Sleeps off the top of the chart. Also around were Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole. There was The Town, Ben Affleck's movie, Easy A. Love Easy A. I need to talk about that soon. Inception was still hanging around after 12 weeks as well. But amongst the audience, I should say it was an international hit as well. We didn't have to wait long for this one in the US. It would go on to gross 96 million in the US, 127 million overseas for a worldwide total of $224 million. A nice return, really, especially for a film that's continued to sell on DVD, Blu-ray, download and all of those services. But amongst the audience for it were some of the people who were depicted in the movie. So, on the day the movie opened in the US, Aaron Sorkin told Deadline that he got a phone call off Eduardo Severin. And, the call had come via producer Scott Rudin. I'm quoting Sorkin here in Deadline, that a representative for Eduardo contacted him late at night. He wanted to see the movie, so we set up a private screening for him in New York right before Lady Gaga's private screening. It's true, he says, because I was just about to say, is that true? Obviously. I went to meet him when the movie was over, and you could have performed surgery on him without anaesthesia at that point in time. I've got to say, he was a deer in the headlights, which is an understatement. He did certainly expect to like the movie a lot, but you could tell in his face he just relived the thing. They only met once, and the terms of Eduardo's settlement remain under lock and key, and the movie didn't really get to that. Mark Zuckerberg saw it as well. He was, as The Guardian reported in 2014, he was a bit hurt by it as well. That he said it made up a bunch of stuff I found kind of hurtful. He said, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that movie in a while. He had said he wasn't going to watch it, and then he did. He said, I think the reality is that writing code and then building the product and building a company is not a glamorous enough thing to make a movie about. So you can imagine that a lot of this stuff they had to embellish or make up. They went out of their way in the movie to try to get some interesting details correct, like the design of the office, but on the overarching plot, they just kind of made up a bunch of stuff that I found kind of hurtful. In particular, it was the sections of Zuckerberg's interactions with the character of Erica that he wasn't particularly happy with. He'd met, Jesse Eisenberg and Mark Zuckerberg had actually met at one point as well, and Zuckerberg said there were pretty glaring things that were just made up about the movie that made it pretty hard to take seriously. In the aftermath of its success, and it remains a success, there was talk at one point about Fincher and Sorkin coming together on a film about Steve Jobs that Sorkin would write the screenplay for, and that was pretty much ready to go, and Fincher in the end decided not to commit to that one. Danny Boyle would take that film on. He would describe it as the only movie he did as a director for hire. I think that came out 2015, 2016 in the end. But for Rooney Mara taking on a really pivotal supporting role in The Social Network, well, she would land herself absolutely in the spotlight for the project that Fincher decided to tackle next. He decided to work with Sony again on The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That is a story for another time. To end this particular story, there is still talk of potentially doing The Social Network 2, given what's happened with Facebook over the last 10 years. Eisenberg said he's interested. Sorkin said he's interested. The person they're all waiting on is David Fincher. We'll just wait and see. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. So just a couple of little bits and bobs here. To remind you, this podcast episode is sponsored by the wonderful folks at cinemaparadiso.co.uk. If you want to give them a try, you can get a 30-day free trial by entering the code FSTORIES, and that gets you a month of movies sent to your house, so that can't be bad. I've also got the latest issue of Film Stories magazine, which is coming back from the printers at the time that this podcast is being recorded. So that's up for pre-order now at store.filmstories.co.uk. You can find out all about that there. A big, huge exclusive with Eddie Izzard. That's waiting for you in that issue. If you like this podcast, please do subscribe at your podcast repository of choice, and ideally leave a hugely positive review as well. That is gold dust to independent podcast producers like myself. That's the kind of thing that keeps us going, gets us noticed, and I can't thank everyone enough who's already done that for me. Just for a bit of variety then, I've done one film directed by a man called David who does an awful lot of takes. Now I'm going to do a film directed by a man called David who does an awful lot of takes. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the second movie I'm going to talk about, the other side of this.
Where are you hit?
It's not that. You're on my groin.
Oh, sorry. All right, now, where is he?
You're too late. Habsburg has plan B in.
Where? All right. Who else is almost dead? Okay, now.
Talk. You're too late, Drebin.
He already said that.
Where did he leave off?
Habsburg has plan B in.
Oh, yeah. Habsburg has plan B in. Where? Talk, you low-life scum. Gee, if that's your attitude, forget it.
That then is a clip from The Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, dating back from 1991, starring the late, great Leslie Nielsen as Lieutenant Frank Drebin, Priscilla Presley, George Kennedy, O.J. Simpson, Robert Goulet, Richard Griffiths, and of course Weird Al Yankovic as police station thug. Directed by David Zucker and written by Zucker and Pat Proft, and of course based on the wonderful Police Squad TV series, which for a series that didn't do an awful lot of business, nor did it get an awful lot of attention at first, it sure did manage to generate an impressive movie trilogy. The first film that spun out of it was, of course, The Naked Gun, which I've covered before on this podcast. That came out in 1988, The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad. When that film went on to be a box office hit, taking $140 million worldwide off a budget, well, the budget of it was just modest. It's about $12 million to make. Paramount Pictures, well, understandably so, quite wanted a sequel. Director David Zucker, he agreed to make it as well, and he did work, even though Naked Gun had been the first film he directed solo. He worked with his brother Jerry Zucker and Jim Abrahams. They were the ZAZ comedy trio, really, behind Airplane and Top Secret and Kentucky Fried Movie. He was keen to return, and he was collaborating with Abrahams and his brother as well as Pat Proft in putting this film together. But nonetheless, the ZAZ team had gone their separate ways, and notably at this point, Jerry Zucker scored the big surprise hit of 1990 with the film Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore, and Oscar winner for that film, Whoopi Goldberg. I will come to it in a future episode. When Ghost happened, David Zucker rang Jerry up and said that pottery scene is going to be a classic, and they could spoof that in the new Naked Gun film. And it duly made it into the movie. But then the writing of it was underway, and the script was absolutely paramount to these movies. I'm going to come to it slightly, but as producer Robert K. Weiss told Film Review magazine, this time we decided to try to explore the rich underpinning of all the characters' emotions and motivations. Then we figured, the hell with it. However, clearly playing it for joke, there was actually a serious streak that ran through the core of what became Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, because David Zucker was keen to add an environmental thread and theme to this one. It was an era where Hollywood was really waking up to environmental issues and plot points and featuring environmental matters in films, like Medicine Man came out around this time, didn't it, if memory serves. And thus David Zucker would tell the Los Angeles Times, I think the movie is educational. We did a lot of research. This is energy stuff. I didn't know. I wonder if people will notice the electric car and things in with all the comedy that they put into the film. And the plot of the movie would follow a villain kidnapping an energy expert trying to get the White House to switch to low pollution energy sources. There are a few Hollywood films dealing with not dissimilar narrative threads at this point. It got to the point actually where the environmental element of it was key to Zucker, that he asked Paramount to make sure when the premiere party came around that any funds raised went to energy research, to tree planting and to recycling causes, and also environmental leaders were invited to the premiere of the second Naked Gun film. But this was still at heart a spoof. This was still a Naked Gun film, and the casting mantra remained the same throughout all the spoof films that the Zucker team made, that you cast people who don't play it for comedy. It's what had led them to Leslie Nielsen. It's what led them to Robert Goulet to play the villain in this particular one. The scripts then came together pretty quickly for this one. As Zucker would say, he'd written a film for the whole family to watch, just not together. And filming got underway on the movie in the Los Angeles area on November the 27th, 1990. And it wasn't the easiest of shoot. There's not stories of people moaning about it particularly, but the interviews that I've read or heard or been able to track down for this, they talk about the process that David Zucker went through to get the comedy right in the film. So the late George Kennedy would talk about this, and he said, he would say that they were doing lots and lots of takes, and he would have no idea what anyone was really doing in the back, doing differently in those individual takes. He was being asked to do more than he'd been asked to do in all the dramatic work that he'd done. As it turned out, Zucker was just tuning little bits and bobs in the background, and those were the things that were making the difference. The things too, like the tempo of the lines change, that Zucker would surgically direct some of this stuff, that he would just tell people just to take it down, just a few percent, if that, minute little changes, and he would shoot and shoot and shoot. And this was the era where digital filming wasn't a thing. It was all done on film. The record was apparently 26 takes, so we're not quite in David Fincher territory here, but still not bad. And that was a dance routine involving Priscilla Presley, which involved her being spun around by Leslie Nielsen's Frank Drebin, and then landing at a table and opening her mouth and nicking an olive off the table. And she had to do this 26 times, and involved her ultimately eating 21 olives throughout the shooting of the film. Even David Zucker's mum actually was cast in this one. Even she had to do multiple takes. She's in the bit where a wheelchair goes over the moon in just a homage to E.T. She at the point where Zucker finally said he's happy with it, she just said, I hope I never have to say the lines I had to say there ever again. Going back to George Kennedy in the interview he gave in the promotion for the film, he would talk about Video Village, really. And Video Village wasn't a massive thing, I don't think, at this point. The idea that you'd have a bank of monitors on the set that people would crowd around. In the case of Naked Gun 2.5, there was a Video Village because it was giving instant feedback to the actors on how well the comedy was playing, that the actors would know they'd landed something when they saw the playback, that they saw the producers, they saw the director looking at the playback and killing themselves laughing. But they would have to do the shots again and again and again until it was right. Richard Griffiths, meanwhile, he'd done primarily serious stuff to this point, but he was cast in two roles. He was cast as both Earl Hacker and the wheelchair bound Dr. Albert S. Meinheimer. And Griffiths really got into the spirit of this one a lot. And Zucker would tell Hollywood.com after he passed away, actually, he said he's a serious actor. And the more serious they are, the more degrees away from comedy they are, the less they try to wink and be in on the fun. And so David Zucker says of directing Richard Griffiths, we asked him not to play it straight, but to play it dead serious. The good actors really get it. The smart actors, they know not to ham it up. Now, there's a perception on spoof films, on comedy movies, that a lot of the moments that you see on screen are some degree of improvisation or something like that. That couldn't be further than the truth with a Naked Gun film. Zucker said that the direction I give most actors is let the lines do the work. And they had rules in place, really, on this one. They did joke, Zucker did joke that there's a strict rule about you can only have one joke at a time, one in the foreground, one in the background, which is something they actually stick to. That they had 15 different rules, and then rule 15 was there are no rules. But then conversely, in an interview that turned up in the book The Directors by Robert Emery, Zucker talked of the importance of sticking to the script in a film like Naked Gun 2. And he describes when Robert Goulet came onto the set to do Naked Gun 2, we were running lines in the rehearsal, so before the shooting, and he said, I was looking down at my script and I didn't recognise any of the words he was saying, and I asked Robert, if he had the right script. I thought that maybe he'd been given another draft of the script, and he told me he was paraphrasing. Just about then, I'm sure he noticed that I turned several colours. And so Zucker took Goulet off the set and to his trailer and just had a chat with him there and then. And he says, please read the lines as they're written. And as Zucker reports it, Goulet was relieved about this, that he was hoping that was the case, but he was just trying too hard to get into the comedy. This wasn't an area that he was known for. Now, Zucker would say that he did always take suggestions from actors. That there's a meritocracy at work on a Naked Gun set, that if you come to work and you've got a better line, then okay, let's have a conversation about it. But that's different from just straight improvising. That Leslie Nielsen said during the promotion of the movie, that when it came to the comedy, you could come up with ideas, but they'd have to try it first and rehearse it to see if it would work. There's no straight improvisation that makes it into the movie. What they did weave in was some contemporary jokes. In fact, there's quite a lot of contemporary stuff in The Naked Gun 2.5 that dates it slightly. There's a whole sequence where they pan across a load of images of disasters, and one at the human face at the end is Michael Dukakis, who had just failed to win the US presidency. One contemporary joke that they went with and weaved in as well involves Zsa Zsa Gabor. She had been arrested for basically attacking a police car, and so at the end of the title sequence, the infamous sequence where the flashing red light goes through the streets, it ends with Gabor going up to the light and just hitting the thing, and that's basically why that was in there. The contemporary reference to that joke has disappeared, and thus it perhaps doesn't land quite as it did, but there it is in there. It was nonetheless a physically taxing film for someone like Leslie Nielsen to do. I mean, as excellent and wonderful as he is in these films, he was edging to mid-70s at the time Naked Gun 2 was done. And he would say, well, when he was making the third movie a few years later, that he was just glad that they'd taken the number of physical scenes that he had to do in that film down, because it had been a bit of a stretch just getting the second movie in the can. The film wrapped up, though, on March the 7th, 1991, and that had been a long shoot. That's 4 months of shooting for what turned out to be an 85-minute comedy. Also, it was an 85-minute comedy with a June the 28th, 1991 release date. So that gave Zucker and his team, including editors Christopher Greenberry and James R. Simons, 3 months, if that, to get the film to a position where they were happy with it. Now, of course, there wasn't special effects work to put in, but there was really tight editing on comedy. I mean, I've spoken to comedy directors who talk about you snip one frame out and it can make a huge amount of difference. And in fact, Zucker did an interview with Empire magazine in its August 1991 issue that I've dug out, and he said we did get pretty scientific in the editing of the movie. He says we play our films to test audiences at a shopping mall. If something doesn't get a laugh, we cut it out or we change the timing and just try again. And in fact, if you go through the end credits of Naked Gun 2, you get an idea of just how much was cut out, because there's a whole list of people who get the credit, people who didn't have lines but we like them. And some of those did originally have lines, but those lines were just cut out. In fact, a longer version of Naked Gun 2.5 would turn up on television that did bring in quite a lot of extra gags in there. I think if you go to IMDb, there's an alternate version section. I mean, have a read through and you'll get details of all the scenes that have been put back into Naked Gun 2.5. One joke that got cut from the second film ended up in the third film. The original ending of a wedding sequence in the second movie was just edited straight into the third. As Robert K. Weiss would say, in order to make the planet safe, we recycled our own jokes. Going back to the edit, though, there's a moment where it goes spoilery, but I kind of figure we're in Naked Gun territory and you're not in it for the massive plot. Robert Goulet plays the character of Quentin Habsburg, and he's villainous in it, and he gets to a point where his demise, we come to his demise, and in the original sequence that was put before test audiences, he took a fall from a 32nd floor window, and then you see a lion taking a run up and savaging it. When that played to a test audience originally, nothing, not a titter, not a murmur from them. What they did is they edited the scene by half a second to make the difference. And the half a second was the lion taking a run up. So instead, what you get in the final movie is you get Habsburg falling, straight in, the lion is there just eating his face off. That brought the house down, and that was how surgical the editing needed to get. And as Zucker told Empire magazine, we got it up to 86% approval rating by the third showing, and that's better than the first Naked Gun. One thing about Zucker as well, he wasn't much of a fan of a film by credits, and so if you see the film, you'll notice it goes at the opening, unfilmed David Zucker, and he was doing that just to take the rise, really, at the fact that directors tended to take that individual credit at the start of film. But also prior to the release of Naked Gun, of course, let's go back to Ghost, which had turned into a huge hit, and that affected the marketing as well, because the film was sold with the glorious tagline from the brother of the director of Ghost, which was true. I mean, they weren't lying to you there. Ghost had turned into a touch point for the movie, of course, but also, why not get voiceover man to do that and just say it over the trailer? Now, Leslie Nielsen did the promo rounds for the film. There's an interview I found on YouTube of him chatting to Arsenio Hall about it. He went on Terry Wogan's programme here in the UK as well. He duly farted his way through a whole collection of high-profile interviews. It really was a bit of a party piece that he was able to, let's just say, exhale gas on demand, and was quite happy to do it on live telly as well, and all power to him. One of the things in the Arsenio Hall interview, though, was he was asked as part of that whether he could ever take a serious role again following playing Frank Drebin in in 2 films and the Police Squad TV series, and he sort of argued that every role was serious after you played Frank Drebin. And of course, Nielsen's background was in serious work, and he would say he was going straight off to do a TV movie of the week that wasn't a comedy. Even on those promotional rounds for the movie, though, there was talk at that point of a third film because they come up with a gag for it. Naked Gun 33 and a third for the record 33, get it, that kind of thing. And so that they were joking about that, and as a result, I mean, ultimately that's what the film ended up being called. But before that, the second film had to premiere, and it duly came out on June the 27th 1991 in the US. Unusually, we get it in the UK the day after. I mean, it never used to work like that. I should point out at the same time, Jim Abrams was off making a spoof of his own. I've covered Hot Shots on a previous podcast, but all of a sudden you had these 2 collaborators who effectively to a degree were going head to head here. Naked Gun 2.5 was coming out in high summer, granted, and Hot Shots was coming out at the end of the year. Both would turn out to be hits. Naked Gun would just slightly edge it, and in fact it would break the rule of sequels, because at this point the rule of sequel was such that if your second movie made 65% of the gross of the first, you were in business. That was a result. Now you expect a sequel to do a lot more than the first film is seen as some degree of setup, and you want to get the $1 billion for the second one. But this was a very different time. The first film took $79 million at the American box office. The second would take $86 million. Not shabby at all. It opened, if you look at what was about in its opening weekend, it topped the chart with a $20.8 million opening weekend in the US, knocking Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves off the top. That had been around for 3 weeks. City Slickers was down to 3rd. The Rocketeer 4th. Dying Young 5th. Backdraft 6th. Jungle Fever. Thelma and Louise. Soap Dish. The only new openers it was up against actually were just a couple of art house releases, Europa and The Reflecting Skin, that had just gone onto a couple of screens. The Naked Gun 2.5 was a hit. In fact, it was a hit to the degree that it would end up at the US box office as the 9th biggest film of the year, grossing 86 million, and falling just behind The Addams Family and ahead of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2: The Secret of the Ooze. Hot Shots, in fact, would be the 12th biggest film of the year with a $69 million gross in the US. The Naked Gun success would take it overseas as well, but then to a point this was pretty much the start of the end, because the critical response hadn't been as good as for the first film, but it was still positive. The Hot Shots would get one sequel. Naked Gun would get one further sequel, but it'd take 2.5 years to get there. And by the time Naked Gun 33 and a third for the record came around, David Zucker would take something of a back seat, and Peter Segal would come on board to direct the movie. Zucker would be on set to school him and help him. And in fact, Segal's gone off to do some plenty of films since, not least a spoof off his own back, Get Smart, starring Anne Hathaway and Steve Carell. There was talk around the release of the third movie, which ultimately went by the title The Final Insult, not for the record, when it made it to the UK. But the feeling was it had been a bit of a trilogy closer, that one. And Nielsen went off and did all sorts of other spoofs. Wrongfully Accused, he did Spy Hard. And so he certainly kept busy. Zucker went off and did the latter half of the Scary Movie films. He did an odd spoof of a Michael Moore documentary as well, if memory serves. But The Naked Gun, well, the stories of that kept coming back, that Paramount was looking to do a reboot of it, that around, 8-10 years ago, there was talk of Ed Helms who'd come to the fore off the back of his work in The Office, the American version of The Office at that point. So he was going to do. More recently, there's talk of a fourth film again, that under Ed Helms it wasn't going to be a spoof, so that was going to be a bit odd. Now we're back with chat about spoofing at a point where Hollywood just seems to have lost the ability to make spoof movies. There was one that David Wayne did a few years ago that was quite good, but now the chat is of a possible fourth Naked Gun film, a reboot of sorts, with Liam Neeson in the lead role and Seth MacFarlane directing. Personally, I believe that when I see it. For now though, The Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, well, it's the peak of the spoof genre at the box office. I just got a feeling it might be a while until that record is taken. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you as always for listening. You can find more of my waffle on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod or at the website, updated every weekday with stories, reviews, news, all sorts of gubbins. www.filmstories.co.uk. You can order all our magazines, including the new issues, at store.filmstories.co.uk. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. Hope their lawyers aren't listening anymore. We're also, where else are we? youtube.com/film stories. Most important thing though, as I bid you farewell for another week, is you all take care and look after yourselves. I thank you so much for your support. I thank you so much for listening. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. The very best to you all. Bye bye.
I'm 6'5", 220, and there's two of me.